Hi, welcome to Learning Leaders Spotlight, the podcast where we interview the learning leaders of today to help the learning leaders of tomorrow. I'm Leanne Langford, your host. I'm the president of Training Pros. Training Pros is an L&D contract staffing company. We like to say when you have more projects than people, let us find you the best consultant to start your project with confidence. I am really pleased today to introduce my guest. I have today Christopher McCormick. He's the Senior Director of Talent Development and Inclusion. Christopher, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks, Leanne, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Christopher, can you tell our audience a little bit about who you are, what you do, where you work, any of that?
Absolutely. Thanks. So again, my name is Christopher McCormick. I'm the Senior Director of Talent Development and Inclusion for Gilead Sciences. We're a top biopharmaceutical firm, and we create life-saving medicines for people, and really are about creating health equity in the world and patient safety, and really at some point curing disease. I know that we won't get to all of those in my lifetime, but for some of them, we've already cured some hepatitis, and I think we'll have some others on the forefront. But my role really is that a catalyst for enabling the functions in the business to really grow and develop the talent of the future. So my role in talent development and inclusion is just that. I manage talent management, which is everything from looking at where people are in their career journey. How do we manage them through their career? How do we think about what are the growth opportunities for them? What are the right things for them to be looking at? Do they need a coach? Do they need a certain intervention? Do they need a certain thing that they need to work through, as well as learning and development for all to think through what is there for everyone who needs to build some capability. And then from an inclusion and diversity perspective, really looking at it from that lens. How do we have the right employee resource groups to set people up to have community that they need to really support their growth and development? How do we set them up for success long term? So my role is really that of a catalyst for change and resiliency throughout the organization.
That sounds like such a job that gives back to you as well as in your giving to others all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So,
It's nice to wake and love what you do and go to work and be like, I actually really enjoy what I do. So that's great.
exactly. If you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. So,
Except when you need expense reports done and you have complaints training. I mean, just saying, there are those things of work that you never love, but you have to do them.
you do have to do that. Um, can you tell our audience about what first attracted you to this field?
So my background is really that in theater. So I started my first big tour, a national tour when I was 6 years old. I grew up in the theater. I went to school for musical theater. I sort of did tours after my undergrad. And so I think that really helped me sort of, and then I sort of fell into like the professional world sort of happenstance wise, because I needed a day job in between my night gigs, and ended up landing a job at a bank and becoming manager and people manager. And I think that what really attracted me once I was in the corporate world was the things that were actually transferable from what I'd grown up and learned, which is really having empathy for people and really understanding where they're coming from and understanding what they're struggling with and what they might need to actually work through the dynamics or the problems or the challenges that they're being faced with. So one of my first jobs, I was working in financial services during mergers and acquisition timeframe and doing a lot of stuff around technical training from one system to another as we were merging and moving systems and integration, very technical training, and working in that space. But then I got promoted into this role where I was managing a team of 50 people who were taking escalation calls from all the different call centers in the country. And that's highly stressful. And so there were some softer skills that needed to, and EQ skills that needed to be worked through, resiliency, change management, stress management, time management. And so really I went to my boss at the time and I said, I'd like to put together a workshop and do this with my team. And can we get some time off the phone to do this work and help them think through how they want to show up differently and do some self-reflection and think about their own leadership? And she was like, yeah, that'll be hard, but we'll figure it out. And we figured it out. And apparently, it was okay. I had no background in instructional design, and it was me cobbling stuff together from different sources and our site training manager came and observed one of the sessions, and she said to me after, she's like, "You're really good at this. You should think about this as part of your career." And about 6 months later, she was at my desk and she said, "There's this opening for this training manager job. I think you'd be great for it. I'm going to recommend you." So that being said, started my entry into the learning and development space, which then led to more of the holistic talent management space and change management and organizational design, et cetera. So that's sort of how I sort of skipped and tripped my way into this field. Not a traditional path.
Not traditional at all. I think that's so amazing that you have that theater background because the platform skills are something that I think that are harder for us to develop, especially me because my background is instructional design, which is a little more introverted, not necessarily get up in front of everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. The facilitation part was always the easier part. Like the being on stage in front of the room, I could do. It's just like I needed to learn the introverted part of like, how do you actually create a solid design and really learning objectives and what does that look like and how do you reinforce and how do you build the skill and how do you do the, not one and done, but what are the sustainable things that you need to build into the flow of the work that will keep in making it easier for people to make it a habit versus just one and done.
Those are definitely the things we go to school to learn and do all our reading and go to the webinars. But it sounds like you started out with almost an instinctual understanding of how to get people to learn what you're teaching, at least based on the feedback you received. So you've been in the industry a while. What are the biggest changes you've seen in the last few years in L&D?
I think the biggest changes I've seen, I think the pandemic really had a huge um, bearing on how we thought about traditional learning and development programs. We really had to turn everything 180 and have everything be virtual. And while that is sometimes a less warm medium or a little bit of a colder medium, we still had to figure out a way to give people the tools and resources that they needed to build capability. And so, how do we do that in an environment that is not as hands on or in person? Or when I think about building any sort of program, I'm always thinking about how do we build your capacity? So, how do we build your mindset to get bigger and expand? So, your cup is so big, you can only fit so much in the cup. How do we make the cup bigger? So, building your capacity and mindset and then building the capability. What are the core skills, whether it's coaching or change management or, a technical skill like coding or any of those things that you need to be able to build that capacity and understand the actual work that needs to get done. But then there's a community. I think so the 3 C's are capacity, capability, community. And I feel like during the pandemic, that sense of community, we struggled to figure out how to do that in a very colder medium and in a virtual land. And I think we've all started to figure it out and we've gone there, but we're still craving that sense of connection. So I feel like the changes that I've seen is everybody went and did a 180, and now we're trying to kind of come back and figure out what's the right modality for when and where, and how do we meet people where they are. And sometimes that in-person stuff you can't really. There is a need for it. There's a need for that connection and community, and so sometimes being in person is requisite for building that kind of congenial connection. So I think we're still figuring out where that is and how we do that the best way. And we'll get better at it as time goes on.
I have to say the sense of community is the one thing that I did notice was missing during the whole shutdown, stay home, wear masks time period. I've worked virtually for many, many years, but I always had ATD. I would go to meetings. I would go and meet people. I would have lunch with people. All of that disappeared. I was just sitting at home every day, all day.
Yeah. And I worked virtually for a lot of my career where I had sort of more of a hybrid. Like I would work from home a few days a week. I'd be in the office a few days a week. So I was sort of conditioned for it. And so when you take even the conditioning of the hybrid piece away and it's just all virtual, it became really, if you didn't find a way to find your pod, if you will, outside of work to build that sort of safety net, it was really hard for people. So I think coming back from that, and now there's a lot of policies around return to office and how many times a week? And are we completely virtual? Are we in a hybrid mode? Are we just all back face to face? I think companies are still struggling to find out their own footing in that realm and what meeting the business needs, meeting the company's needs, and then meeting the employees' needs and figuring out what's the right balance between those has become a struggle I think all companies are going through. And no matter what you land on, it's not going to be perfect. And so you're going to have to figure out what's the dynamic you're trying to create and what's the culture you're trying to create when you're making a decision around that type of structure for people.
That's great. So yeah, I agree with you. That was a huge change. What do you see? What do you see us going in the next 5 years in L&D? What changes do you see on the horizon?
We have been very good at building programs, solutions, offerings, if you will, that are very much targeted to audiences that make sense. Whether I'm talking to a VP plus audience or I'm talking to my director, senior director audience, or I'm talking to my senior manager audience, or I'm talking to individual contributors, we're very good at figuring out who's the right audience and how do we tailor the solution to them. I think where we're going to head to and where we're continuing to head to is really what's the experience individually and how do I create an employee experience that is really rooted to Leanne, that's really rooted to Christopher, and also still has that community piece of it. But my capability may be in a very different place from instructional design than yours, and your capability around facilitation may be very in a different place than mine. So the solution can't be, well, here's this thing you need to go do. I think tailored, very much custom experiential to the individual level is going to be where we start to go. And I think AI is going to give us an opportunity to understand those algorithms and understand those individuals in a way more personalized way, whether good or bad. I think sometimes I get my Netflix recommendations like, why do I think watch? Are they peeking around the corner? Who's spying on me? Right. And so it can get a little like Big Brother watching over, but I do think that as it gets better and the large language models get more intricate and the cybersecurity gets better along with it, I think that we start to see an opportunity to really tailor and cater specific offerings to more at an individualized level and still be able to create that sense of community within cohorts that makes sense for where people are.
That's very exciting.
It is very exciting.
It is. I mean, for so many years, it's just cookie cutter. It's like, okay, well, this was your assessment. So here's your prescription,
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And I also think like master classes, like depending on what you want to go do, if you're, a behavioral scientist or psychologist and you need to go work and you could have a chat bot with, Carl Jung of the past or a Sigmund Freud of past, and they're there because they've done enough research that it feels like you're actually sitting across from one of those people that you would never have had the opportunity to interact with. That's on the horizon too. I think the way in which we can start to interact with people it's a little scary sometimes, but also it is exciting.
wow, that really is. Let's switch gears. Can you share with our audience who was one of the most influential professional mentors you had?
Influential professional I've had great, um, very lucky in my career to have had great, um, managers. I've had a few bad ones along the way. I'd say that's more the outlier than the norm. And I've really had the opportunity to learn and grow from a lot of different people. Someone I will point to that really helped be a catalyst for my career was a woman. Her name is Nancy Cragen, and hopefully she'll listen to this podcast. She was one of those people who, like, before we had diversity and inclusion, before we had those words, before we had those behaviors were just sort of innate in her nature. And so she always wanted to hear from all the voices in the room. She would always make sure that people who were a little bit more introverted and didn't speak up, that she got that voice in the room, that people who were a little more extroverted, were, tamed down a bit so that we could hear from everyone. She also had a diverse team of people from all aspects, from age to race to gender to sexual orientation to religious backgrounds. Like she would orchestrate and really build leadership teams of diversity and inclusion to get the best ideas in the room, get the best people in the room. And that was something I learned pretty early in my career. I think I was in my later 20s when I joined one of her leadership teams, and I was just sort of soaking it all in and just being like, how does she do that? Why does she do that? How do you build those types of dynamic teams? And so that's sort of somebody who I always sort of look to and go, when you think of like what would certain people do, I'd be like, what would Nancy do in this situation? And then I sort of have an answer and an inclination, and then I'll run with that because it's usually the right one.
Having a professional mentor, particularly earlier in our careers, is so critical. And one of the reasons I like to ask that question is we are targeting the folks who are trying to move up in their careers, and finding a professional mentor that's really going to influence how you grow your career and how you make decisions is so important. So it's wonderful that you had her.
Yeah, and that was just because she was my direct manager, right? So I'd actually been introduced to her through a different piece, and I actually reached out to her because I saw that in her. So for younger people looking for your career, be willing to ask for a mentor. If you see someone who you really admire or see a trait in, be willing to reach out and take the risk. They may say no, that's not doesn't mean anything about you. They may just be overloaded with a lot of other people who've asked. So don't get discouraged. But I would also encourage people who see people that they want to emulate or see really great traits that they want to learn from, be willing to ask. And it may just be once a quarter versus once a month or whatever works for you and the mentor that you'd like to seek out. But don't get discouraged. And being willing to ask for a mentor is critical.
Fantastic advice. So you're often in a position to hire either employees or contractors or vendors. What skill or role do you find to be the hardest one to locate and hire? Yeah, is there a skill or something that's very difficult to find these days for you?
I would say, honestly, the hardest thing is to find we're getting so much data so quickly. Sort of the data and analytics of the past are not sufficient. How do we build insights that are going to help us really shape how we want to move forward as a business? So I would say someone with that data science background and with that lens of everything that we're going to propose or do or offer up to stakeholders, having sort of some data science foundational look at how you look at data and not just go with numbers, but how do you synthesize that data and create insights out of it to create a business case or a story that's compelling to get stakeholders engaged. I always find that to be challenging because we're getting inundated with so much data all the time. And we have more and more of it coming at us all the time. So getting people who understand the data and can create insights, but then also can tell the story behind it. So storytellers, insights, data storytellers. I don't know if there's a role out there called that yet, but that's what I would say is something that I always find unique when I see that in people and people who can do that. I'm always compelled to be like, that's they're going to be useful. They're going to add something to the team and to the mix that's going to help us be elevated and move us forward.
So I can't agree with you more about we are inundated with a lot of data now, but even way back when I was in corporate in the 1990s, being able to tell the story of the data was the biggest skill we had to have. So we had to be able to show in a one-page pitch page what was going on in L&D so the CLO could present it to the C-level suite.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very hard to do.
That's not changed, but keeping it on one page now with the amount of data that we have now is even harder. So I think still getting the headlines to the right level and getting the story behind it so people can really understand is a critical skill. I don't think it's ever going to go away. It's just going to get more dynamic and more challenging. And especially if you go back to what I said earlier around where I see us going, where we're actually creating an employee experience at the Leanne level or at the Christopher level or at the whoever's listening level, that's going to be hard, right? Because that's really specific to every person on the team or in the company or in that group or that function. And so that becomes a really interesting challenge from a data perspective.
Very good. Um, where do you get your industry news?
I get a lot of interesting industry news from different sources. So I would say, again, I'm in the pharmaceutical industry, so I get a daily digest from Fierce Pharma just to kind of know what's happening from the industry trend perspective. What are competitors doing? Where are their, clinical trials and phases and readouts and all of that stuff. So just from an industry perspective, Fierce Pharma is my go-to source. From an HR in general, HR perspective, Gartner, lots of different places, that I look to around what are the McKinsey industry trends from those places that are giving me more high level HR stuff. And when I say more like talent or L&D, I'm part of a talent development think tank group. So they have, weekly offerings for L&D professionals, talent development professionals. So I belong to that group and I go to the ones that I can. They have them weekly. I can maybe make one a month. But then there's also the talent development think tank. So there's podcasts related to that. So get information there. Also, from an inclusion perspective, the Will to Change podcast by Jennifer Brown. I listen to that a lot. She's got a lot of industry experts around inclusion and diversity, a lot of insights and talent around that. Um, so lots of different sources, either podcasts or industry, publishers who are giving me lots of different things. I4CP is a great place to go for industry knowledge around anything HR related, human capital related. And you can specifically ask for, I want a track around learning and development. I want a track around inclusion and diversity. I want to track around talent management. So you can sort of cater what gets fed to you based on what your interests are. People will come to me and be like, you've got to listen to this podcast. So I'll go out and seek. I'm very curious. I'm always wanting to learn more and know more connections in the industry and learn from one another. I think we're better as a community than we are in our own little island. So
Couldn't agree more. And I found it interesting that you started with the industry news for the industry you work in. So not L&D, but the pharma industry, the biotech industry. I think that that's great advice also for the learning leaders of the future. If you're working in pharma or you're working in banking or where manufacturing, you need to be paying attention to the industry news, your industry as well.
I honestly would consider myself a business leader first. So if I can't be an L&D leader, I can't be an HR leader, I can't be anything if I don't know what the business is that I'm serving. So unless I can walk into a room and my CFO expects me to know exactly what's happening in the market and where we talk to an investor call, he expects me to know those things. I can't get his ear around something that I want him to pay attention to if I can't actually speak his language. So, in some ways, I think if I don't understand the business, you shouldn't have me in the room. And until you do understand the business you're supporting and know where they're headed, and from a strategic perspective, then don't ask to be in the room. You've got to know, who your audience is and what you're there for. And ultimately, we enabling functions, whether you're finance, legal, public affairs, communications, L&D, all of those enabling functions, our role is to really understand the business first and then come in with solutions that are going to help them get what they need to reach business goals.
Great advice. Okay. Last question. I always ask this. What is one book you would recommend everybody read who wants to be a learning leader?
Their one book. There's so many. I would say one of the go-tos for me, because I do think all learning leaders and all people in an L&D field are at some level a consultant to the business. So my go-to is Peter Block's Flawless Consulting. It's one that I go to frequently, reread, do my own skill practice around sometimes. But I find that one to be highly useful for anybody who's in a sort of consulting role. So any of those enabling functions that I mentioned earlier, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're an L&D professional, whether you're a finance person, Flawless Consulting is one of those key things that I think help any somebody who's more of a consultant to the business and trying to enable the function to grow from a business perspective. So that would be my go-to for any sort of consulting leader. I have others, but I'll go with that one as my, and they're not paying me to say that.
Of course not. I ask everyone, but I love that you mentioned that book. I read it in my my graduate program in education. I took a HRD master's program, and they would have us read business books, things like Flawless Consulting, because the biggest thing they kept saying is you're serving the business. You need to understand how to work in a business. So I thought Flawless Consulting was a fantastic recommendation. Makes me want to go read my copy again.
Yeah, I have 3 versions of it at this point. I'm like,
Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us on our podcast. You've given a lot of really great information. I think it's going to help a lot of people that listen to the podcast with the growth in their careers. As a thank you, I would like to plant 5 trees in your name. Our charity at Training Pros is we plant trees around the world. We've planted close to 4,000 trees at this point on behalf of our consultants and our podcast guests. So I'll be sending you a certificate about where we planted the trees for you. And that's just my big thank you for you.
thank you, Leanne, and thank you, Training Pros, for inviting me to be here. And thank you, listeners. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have follow-up questions or want to connect. Be happy to have you as part of my community.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.